This is the WM Review podcast, wmreview.org. Private revelations, theology, and the crisis. What should be their relationship? Throughout history, God has made private revelations to chosen souls, even for the public good. We could consider the revelations made to St. Joan of Arc, which led to the victory of France over English rule, or the revelations of the Sacred Heart to St. Margaret Mary Alacoque. In our time, we can call to mind the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima in Portugal. At the WM Review, we believe that the revelations of Fatima carry a continuing importance for the Church and the world. But at this time, it's more important than ever to have the proper role of such revelations clearly fixed in our minds and to understand how they interact with the doctrine and the theology of the Church. But what is this proper role, and what is the relationship between private revelations and theology, particularly regarding the decisions we must make in the post-conciliar wreckage? The best way of examining this wider issue is in light of the Fatima apparitions themselves. When we see the proper place of private revelations which are so well attested and have such approbation from the Church, the place of less well attested and less clearly approved apparitions and private revelations will be thrown into greater relief. Over the past 60 years, various different groups have tried to co-opt the messages at Fatima in support of their theological positions. Some have even gone further and used these revelations to rule out competing theological positions. To take a controversial example, it's well known that some of us have concluded, based on the facts and on traditional theology, that the Holy See is currently vacant, and that Francis cannot be the legitimate Roman pontiff. Some go further, we do, and apply it to Francis's recent predecessors too. However, some believe that Our Lady's request for the Pope to consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart refutes such conclusions about Francis and the post-conciliar claimants to the papacy. In other words, this request to consecrate Russia is taken as proof that Francis and his recent predecessors must have all been true popes. What are we to make of this? Whatever we think of the conclusion, is this a proper way to go about studying difficult questions? There's a few points to make. Number one, attempts to shut down the debate. While there can be genuine questions on how the Pope question and the Fatima messages work together, arguments based on a supposed incompatibility are often attempts to end the debate through an appeal to perceived authority. This is essentially pious browbeating, by which someone uses his private interpretation of private revelation to shame his interlocutor into silence. It's not legitimate to use such shame tactics based on private revelations in theological reasoning. If a Catholic in good faith is making erroneous points, these points must be refuted in a systematic way and not just shamed off the table. Ad hominem arguments can feasibly be used as rhetorical devices at the service of truth. But any attempt to use private revelations in this way betrays a lack of real arguments, a lack of understanding of any given controversy, and a serious misunderstanding of the relationship between private revelations and theology. 2. It bypasses the actual issues. By trying to short-circuit the discussion and shut down the debate, the actual issues are left in a sort of limbo. The issues do not go away or lose their importance simply because somebody thinks that a private revelation contradicts a given conclusion. To return to the previous example, those who hold to the conclusion that Francis and his recent predecessors cannot have been legitimate popes do so not because of any emotional reaction to the crisis, but because of numerous considerations arising from the Church's teaching about herself. In particular, 1. The radical incompatibility between open heresy and membership of the Church, and thus also being elected or holding office in the Church. 2. The incompatibility between the Church's infallibility and the imposition of a new conciliar or conciliar synodal religion following Vatican II. and this is specifically manifested in the imposition of universal disciplinary laws which are harmful and deleterious to the Catholic religion, and also the practical cessation of teaching and governing with authority being replaced with the mere proposition of multiple errors of varying notes, and the tyrannical exercise of raw power and weaponized orthodoxy working to the detriment of the Catholic religion with little regard for the rule of law. 3. The after-the-fact evidence that Francis and his predecessors, even if they were indeed eligible for the election, they failed to accept the election to the papacy as traditionally understood. This defect of consent being due to accepting a new conciliar synodal papacy incompatible with the Roman pontificate, akin to the defects of consent we see in marriage cases. And 4, the non-identity of the conciliar synodal church and the Roman Catholic Church, which alone is the true Church of Christ, with the vacancy of the Holy See being the only sufficient cause. So they're the 4 basic reasons why we might conclude that there's been a long vacancy. But let's grant, for the sake of argument, that the messages of Fatima do indeed prove that Paul VI and so on were legitimate popes. If this were so, we would still be left with all of the above considerations that led to the other conclusion in the first place. Some may think they've saved the claims of Francis and so on through their private interpretation of private revelation, but they would only have done so at the expense of a received and traditional body of theology, which is very well established in the Church. This happens because they've misunderstood the relevant points and the force of the arguments. This approach to private revelation implies either A, that this body of theology, approved and used by the Church, was in error, which is untenable for the reasons we will discuss, or B, that the non-pope conclusion did not in fact flow from the premises. In general, those taking this approach don't really seem to realise the catastrophic implications of the first option, that the traditional theology was wrong, nor do they take any serious effort to demonstrate the second. Even less do they realise that if their private interpretations of private revelations contradict the settled theses of theology, then this is a very worrying sign indeed. If that theology, received, approved, promoted by the Church for centuries, was wrong, then it's difficult to see how the toleration of such a false body of theology would not have already constituted a defection of the Church. But this is impossible, therefore the solution must lie elsewhere. This problem could lie either in a misunderstanding of the theology or in a misunderstanding of contingent facts. We believe we've taken all due precautions to understand this theology correctly, and as such us who take this position, we choose what it teaches over the contingent claims of particular claimants. But this raises an interesting question. What if a miraculous sign appeared to attest to the validity of such men's claims to the papacy? So I'm thinking here particularly of Francis's 2022 consecration of Russia and Ukraine to the Immaculate Heart. What would it have meant if some miraculous event had followed from it, such as the conversion of Russia? Although this event is in the past and little appears to have come from it, this issue remains relevant because such questions could easily arise about future signs and wonders. Let's imagine that something like a spectacular conversion of Russia occurred. Such an event might be more or less impressive in its nature, but even if it appeared to be a true conversion, it would not somehow resolve the many questions around the recent popes by the back door. If it were to resolve the pope question by the back door, by default, it would require a radical rethink of those doctrinal issues already mentioned, which had pointed to that conclusion. In this context, rethinking is perhaps too polite. If we accept Francis as Pope, if we insist that he's Pope, then we must reject the settled Catholic doctrine on those issues of membership, ecclesiology, infallibility, and so on, which we cannot do. As such, this just brings us back to the dilemma above. In any case, it seems inevitable that such potential signs and wonders would cause serious division amongst Catholics trying to hold to tradition. Such division would be impossible, though, if we made traditional theology our criteria for truth, rather than our private interpretations of private revelations and apparently miraculous occurrences. Number 3, it's not the purpose of private revelations. As suggested above, private revelations are not the proper data by which theological questions are decided. It's true that we're told that some theologians, such as St. Thomas Aquinas, were assisted in their theological work by apparitions of saints. In his case, Saints Peter and Paul appeared to help him with Bible commentaries. But while we may believe this to be true, the reality is that St. Thomas's writings come to us with his authority and that of the Church approving them, not with the authority of such apparitions, and this is so even if they were true apparitions. Some apparitions may provide a sort of confirmation of certain ideas. For example, the words of Our Lady of Lourdes in 1858, she said, "I am the Immaculate Conception." These are taken to be a confirmation of the 1854 definition. But while this is interesting and edifying, we should be clear that we did not need such a confirmation for something that had just been defined by the Church. The Church's definitions do not need miraculous confirmation. Aside from this being an improper way of approaching theology or ascertaining the truth in difficult situations, we should also recall that private revelations generally serve a particular purpose and ought not to be used to comment on some other issue. For Fatima, this includes several important instructions for our day, including the universal call to penance, the daily recitation of the Rosary, devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart by the Pope in union with the bishops, and First Saturdays for lay people, warnings about what would happen if various requests were not fulfilled, and so on. But these revelations were not intended to settle questions like those around the status of the post-conciliar popes, although perhaps the unreleased Third Secret may contain something on this topic. If someone wants to say that they were intended to settle such questions, well, they've got to prove that claim. It would also be a mistake to take the apparent silence of an approved apparition as a piece of theological data. God has his own reasons for deciding what to reveal to his chosen souls, and we should not read into things in this way. I'm saying here, as far as we're aware, there's no statement to Sister Lucy and so on that there'd be a long vacancy of the Holy See. But that silence is not theological data. For theology as a science, what private revelations tell us, or don't tell us, might be interesting, enlightening, and useful, but there's no reason at all to think that the Fatima apparitions are intended by God to settle theological disputes amongst traditionalists decades later. Radical theological disputes from history, like that about grace and so on, have not been resolved in this way, and this creates a strong presupposition against this idea. Needless to say, there's even less reason to think that heaven would intend to cause a radical reform of the established and traditional theology of the Church by means of a private revelation applied indirectly to an issue that was not at hand at the time. Any apparition that did try to cause such a thing would be immediately suspect. Saying this does not mean that the importance of private revelation is necessarily limited to the chosen soul itself. Think of the national significance of the Sacred Heart for France, for example. I'm also not saying that they can't be enormously important for our time. It's possible that when our current crisis is resolved, the resolution will be confirmed by miracles related to Fatima, like the conversion of Russia, or miracles of a similar level. But the triumph of the Church will itself be a great moral miracle. But we've got to keep things in the right order and remember that the Catholic religion, as represented in the magisterium, theological works and catechisms, is already complete and sufficient. The relative difficulty in hearing the voice of a living hierarchy in our day does not transfer the power of magisterium from the Church to private revelation, seers, miracle workers, dreamers of dreams. On the contrary, our duty in this time is to adhere firmly, immovably to tradition, as found in the Acts of the quasi-contemporary magisterium, as the theologian Nicolau calls it, and the monuments of tradition, particularly traditional theology. There are no secret, mystical, or esoteric updates to our religion ahead of us, and a radical reformation or rejection of traditional theology on the basis of private revelation would be just that. Point 4. Illogical arguments and inaccurate representations of the revelations themselves. Let's note that the arguments mentioned don't even make sense as arguments. We can see this most clearly when they're expressed in syllogistic form. For example, 1. Heaven never requests or commands an impossibility. That's a true premise. 2. Heaven would be requesting an impossibility if, in 1929, Our Lady of Fatima requested that the Pope consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart, and there's been a long interregnum from around 1965 or so. This is a false premise. Conclusion: therefore, there cannot have been a long interregnum from around 1965. But this second premise is clearly gratuitous. The popes prior to a post-conciliar interregnum could have fulfilled the request, and so could a pope after that interregnum. As such, the conclusion doesn't follow. But it's even more absurd, and I mean it's really very absurd, to insist that a group of putative popes must have been legitimate because otherwise they could not have done something that they did in fact not do. Further, as we discussed elsewhere, the actual words of the messages of Fatima can even be read so as to promise a long interregnum if the divine requests were not fulfilled. Does this prove our point? No, because it doesn't work like that, but it's just interesting, and it does show the uncertainty of these arguments as presented. All of this goes to show the danger of using private interpretations of private revelations to overthrow the settled theses of theology. Typically, those doing so are not quite aware of what they're doing and simply deny that this is what their ideas entail. We're as interested in the Fatima messages as anyone else. We've got a lot of material on it on the site, but we must keep an order of priority of things in our minds. We do not need these things in the same way that we need our basic catechism, basic doctrine, and basic theology. But if this is how we should treat revelations approved by the Church, should we not fly anything that takes us away from these foundational things like the catechism or runs contrary to them, as well as all kinds of esotericism and all kinds of thirst for mystical novelties? Let the same principles stand also for any apparent miracles in our day. Credulity is not a Christian virtue. We should be slow to conclude that something is a miracle, and we should be cautious interpreting what claims, persons, or groups a miracle apparently vindicates. Again, although I've taken the Fatima revelations as the focus of this short piece, I'm not denying their singular and ongoing importance for our time, nor am I criticising anyone interested in these revelations. But I am arguing that private revelations cannot be used to contradict traditional theology or the conclusions that flow from it without falling into very serious problems. Thanks very much for listening. This is SD Wright from WM Review. That's wmreview.org. Please head over there and see what we got for you. Thanks very much.